The core to the short story by Jorge Luis Borges, The Garden of Forking Paths, is an account of his ancestor Ts'ui Pen's Labyrinth, which is given to our narrator, a great-grandson of that man, Yu Sun, who is a secret agent. And Stephen Albert, is a sinologist. He's engaged in this massive undertaking which involves understanding and then translating Ts'ui Pen's novel, which turns out to be The Garden of Forking Paths. And we're going to get some prefigurations of this a little bit earlier in the story. So as the narrator is getting on his way to Stephen Albert's house, he's told, turn left at each intersection. This gets him thinking about mazes. And then he says, not for nothing am I the great-grandson of that Ts'ui Pen who was governor of Yunnan province and who renounced all temporal power in order to write a novel containing more characters than the Hulung Meng and construct a labyrinth in which all men would lose their way. Ts'ui Pen devoted 13 years to those disparate labors, but the hand of a foreigner murdered him, and his novel made no sense, and no one ever found the labyrinth. It was under English trees that I meditated upon that lost labyrinth. Now, notice how he's going to figure it. I pictured it perfect and inviolate on the secret summit of a mountain. I pictured its outlines blurred by rice paddies or underwater. I pictured it as infinite, a labyrinth not of octagonal pavilions and paths that turn back on themselves, but of rivers and provinces and kingdoms. So labyrinth as world, he says then, I imagined a labyrinth of labyrinths, a maze of mazes, a twisting, turning, ever-widening labyrinth that contained both past and future and somehow implied the stars. So now we get to a metaphysical labyrinth that involves not just space, but time. When Albert welcomes him to his house, he actually mistakes him for a consul, and he says, I see that the compassionate Ts'ui Pen has undertaken to remedy my solitude. You will no doubt wish to see the garden. And then the narrator says, the garden? The garden of forking paths. Something stirred in my memory, and I spoke with incomprehensible assurance, the garden of my ancestor, Ts'ui Pen. Your ancestor, your illustrious ancestor, please come in. Then Stephen Albert will begin to explain the mystery. He's going to say, yeah, it was an amazing life, Ts'ui Pen's, governor of the province in which he'd been born, a man learned in astronomy, astrology, and the unwearying interpretation of canonical books, a chess player, a renowned poet, and calligrapher. He abandoned it all in order to compose a book and a labyrinth. And now notice what he says next. He renounced the pleasures of oppression, justice, the populous marriage bed, banquets, and even erudition in order to sequester himself for 13 years in the pavilion of limpid solitude. Upon his death, his heirs found nothing but chaotic manuscripts. The family were about to deliver them to the fire, but his counselor, a Taoist or Buddhist monk, insisted on publishing them. And then the narrator says, to this day, we who are descended from Ts'ui Pen execrate that monk. It was senseless to publish those manuscripts. The book is a contradictory jumble of irresolute drafts. I once examined it myself. In the 3rd chapter, the hero dies, yet in the 4th, he is alive again. As for Ts'ui Pen's other labor, his labyrinth, and Albert says, here's his labyrinth. And he gestures at a tall lacquered writing cabinet. He says, it's a labyrinth of symbols, an invisible labyrinth of time. I, an English barbarian, have somehow been chosen to unveil the diaphanous mystery. And he says, Ts'ui Pen must have at one time remarked, I shall retire to write a book. And at another point, I shall retire to construct a labyrinth. Everyone expected 2 projects, but they're actually the same thing. And so the novels, he says, confusion, confusedness, I mean, of course. Now, we should think about that for a moment. What's the difference between confusion and confusedness? Confusion implies that something really is confused. It's a mess. Confusedness, beneath the appearance of confusion, there is an underlying and deeper order. So it suggests to Albert that Ts'ui Pen's novels are actually a labyrinth. What is going on there? Well, how can a novel be a labyrinth? Well, there is a letter which functions as a leading clue. He says, I read the words of a man of my own lineage had written with painstaking brushstrokes. This is the narrator again. I leave to several futures, in parentheses, not to all, my garden of forking paths. So, what does this letter actually mean? Albert says, before unearthing this letter, I was going down the wrong path. I thought about how a book could be infinite. The only way I could surmise was that it would be a cyclical or circular volume, a volume whose last page would be identical to the first, so no one might go on indefinitely. I recalled that night at the center of the 1001 Nights when the Queen Scheherazade begins to retell verbatim the story of the 1001 Nights with the risk of returning once again to the night on which she's telling it, and so on ad infinitum. So that's one way to have infinity, is circularity, right? I also pictured to myself a Platonic, hereditary sort of work passed down from father to son, in which each new individual would add a chapter or with reverent care correct his elders' pages. Okay, so that's another way of perhaps having something that's infinite. But, he says, none of them seem to correspond even remotely to Ts'ui Pen's contradictory chapters. Then I got the letter. I leave to several futures, not to all, my garden of forking paths. Instantly, he says, I saw it. The garden of forking paths is the novel. So how is this going to work? He says, it several futures, not all, suggested to me the image of a forking in time rather than in space. A full rereading of the book confirmed my theory. And how is this going to work? Well, in the novel, the contradictions involve characters choosing multiple ways of going. Now, the way that we typically think about actions and choices is that, the future is not yet set. We choose what we're going to do, so we choose a future for ourselves. He says, in all fictions, each time a man meets diverse alternatives, he chooses one and eliminates the others. He chooses what the future, becoming present, will actually look like. And so in the work of the virtually impossible to disentangle Ts'ui Pen, the character chooses differently. How does he choose? He chooses simultaneously all of them. He creates, thereby, several futures. Now, this is already getting interesting metaphysically. Albert is going to go on and say he doesn't just create several futures, or several presents perhaps, he creates several times. Each choice produces at least 2 times, perhaps more. If there's 3 alternatives to choose between, 3 times, right? So this is something that I think many of us are familiar with from, various fiction, mostly science fiction, where we have alternative timelines and sometimes they come together. There's ways in which they can communicate with each other and all of this sort of stuff. So that is what is happening in the novel. He goes on and he says, Fang, let us say, has a secret. A stranger knocks at his door. Fang decides to kill him. Naturally, there's various possible outcomes. Fang could kill the intruder can kill Fang. They can both live, they can both be killed, and so on. In Ts'ui Pen's novels, all of the outcomes, in fact, occur. Each is the starting point for further bifurcations. Once in a while, the paths of that labyrinth converge. For example, you come to this house, but in one of the possible paths, you're my enemy and another my friend. So then he reads an example of it. I'm not going to go through that. It has to do with an army and the various sources and the various paths that they could go on. And then Albert is going to say, I don't believe your venerable ancestor played at idle variations. I don't think it's possible he would sacrifice 13 years to the infinite performance of a rhetorical exercise. The novel was a genre beneath contempt in your country at the time. So what was he doing? The testimony of his contemporaries proclaims his metaphysical and mystical leanings, and his life is their fullest confirmation. The novel itself is filled with philosophical debate, and he says, I know of all the problems, none disturbed him, none gnawed at him like the unfathomable problem of time. And then he says, here's a little sub-mystery. He never uses that word time in the novel. Why? And so, the narrator, Ts'ui, is going to propose several different possibilities. And he says, no, none of those actually work. Here's how we can figure it out. In a riddle whose answer is chess, what is the only word that must not be used? I thought for a moment, the word chess. Exactly, Albert said. The Garden of Forking Paths is a huge riddle or parable whose subject is time. To always admit one word to employ awkward metaphors and obvious circumlocutions is the most emphatic way of calling attention to that word. So that is what is going on in the novel. The novel is about time itself. And he says that I've read through all these manuscripts, I've corrected errors, I've reached a hypothesis for the plan of that chaos. I have actually reestablished the fundamental order of the novel. So he's translated and he's also edited. What is the point of it? He says, the explanation for the word time not being in there is obvious. The Garden of Forking Paths is, he says, an incomplete but not false image of the universe as conceived by Ts'ui Pen. It is a model of, we could say, metaphysics, how things actually work, not just the universe at one slice of time or point of history, but the universe as time itself. So what is it actually offering? He tells us that unlike Newton and Schopenhauer, your ancestor did not believe in a uniform and absolute time, as many of us perhaps do. Instead, he believed in an infinite series of times. So there's a number of different times at any given time, you could say. We're probably using time in an equivocal way by saying that. And what does he go on? A growing, dizzying web. So it's not just that timelines go off and then it's a million different possibilities and further branchings and all of that. There is some of that going on, but it's a web. How can it be a web? Well, it is of divergent, convergent, and parallel times. So times diverge because people make decisions or outcomes happen differently, but eventually they come back together after running parallel for a while. So what that implies is perhaps sometimes you can't break these things off infinitely and make decisions that send a timeline off on its own course. It will come back sooner or later into another timeline as forking paths, right? Paths unfork, you could say, and become the same path. So he says the fabric of times that approach one another, fork, are snipped off, or are simply unknown for all centuries, contain all possibilities. So this is an exhaustive, comprehensive theory of time. These timelines, these forking paths, encompass all possible arrangements of things within the universe in time. So they're incredibly complex. Now, there are some interesting implications for individual persons. He says, think about us. In most of those times, we do not exist. In some, you exist, but I do not. In others, I do, and you do not. In others, still, we both do. So we got 4 different possibilities there. Not just 4 times, but a whole bunch of them. And then, assuming both of them exist, what is their connection with each other? He says, in this one, which the favoring hand of chance has dealt me, you have come to my home. In another, when you come through my garden, you find me dead. In another, I say these same words, but I am an error, a ghost. And interestingly, Ts'ui is going to say, in all I am grateful for, and I venerate your recreation of the garden of Ts'ui Pen. And Albert says, oh, no, not in all. Time forks perpetually into countless futures. In one of them, I am your enemy. And the narrator says, I felt again that pullulation I have mentioned. I sensed that the dew-drenched garden that surrounded the house was saturated infinitely with invisible persons. These persons were Albert and myself, secretly, busily at work, multiform in other dimensions of time. So for a moment, he perceives or he imagines all of these other, or at least some of the other timelines that are possible. A dizzying, vertigo-inducing prospect, perhaps. So the novel then shifts into the narrative of the secret agents, which we've already talked about elsewhere. But I do want to point out one other thing. So this is not a completely unique model that is being suggested by Borges here. We can find, similar discussions in other authors, perhaps not done with such literary excellence, mostly in science fiction stories. But we also find something similar to this in, I suppose we can call it recent analytic philosophy, by virtue of, considering things from, say, the 1980s onward recent, although that's quite a time back, from where we are at present. There is this entire field called possible world semantics, which, by the way, is not completely unique. We have people like Leibniz thinking about these sorts of things as well and being drawn upon partly for inspiration. But this notion of there being infinite possible worlds within which some of us exist, some of us don't, and if I exist across them, I probably have different characteristics, different predicates, different acts, different sufferings. Well, that isn't exactly the Garden of Forking Paths, but it's a similar kind of model. So this is actually, something that does get discussed, you might say, from the side or obliquely by philosophers in the present. So this is the kernel of the Garden of Forking Paths, some very interesting metaphysical speculations on the nature, not just of time, but times, plural, as a Garden of Forking Paths.